You, Jess. And hello, everybody. We've got a real broad range of where everyone's from tonight, which is actually going to be a feature of something that I'm going to be talking about, because obviously we are talking about EOTAS, and it is probably one of the most complicated things in the world of navigating SEND provision. Now, I'm going to share my screen so you can see my lovely slides. And I will say that these slides actually need a tiny little update. And that is because now the term for EOTAS is actually changed or changing to EOTIS, an I instead of the A. Education otherwise than in school rather than at school. Just a little nugget of information there. Might be interesting, but if you see EOTIS and you're a bit confused and you think what's what, is it EOTAS, is it EOTIS, it means the same thing. It's education otherwise than in or at school, and by school we're talking about anywhere that would ordinarily be named in section I on an EHC plan, and we'll get to the ins and outs of that shortly. Now, I can see already that we're getting a lot of questions in the Q&A. And what Charlotte, my colleague, is probably doing at the moment is telling you that we're going to answer them live, or that I'll probably come to them in the slides. Because there are so many people watching, I'm going to try to make this webinar quite question heavy, because normally it's quite a legal heavy webinar. And I get the sense tonight that there are probably a lot of people new to the world of EOTAS with a lot of questions. And I want to make sure I answer as many as possible. That said, there are a lot of you tonight, and I can only apologise in advance if we don't get to your question. I'll probably say that a lot during this webinar. What I would encourage you to do is to get in touch with us. If you have a really bespoke sort of personalised situation and it might be too complex to actually address on a public forum, I would definitely recommend getting in touch with us via our inquiries page, which I know one of the team will be posting in the chat. Which I can't see when I'm doing these slides particularly easily because I get really distracted and start reading things instead of talking. So yeah, if you do have a question, you don't feel it's been answered, please get in touch, because it's not my intention to ignore anybody or avoid any questions. I'm going to try and get through as many as I can. So with that said, our disclaimer that we always do at the beginning of webinars is essentially that the information that we give you this evening is from a place of great care and attention, and all the information that we give you at the time of writing should be correct, but we would always say, particularly with really complex cases around EOTAS, you know, seek further advice, seek that sort of personalized approach of an individual call, if not with us, you know, with a solicitor or another advisor type, because that would be what I'd recommend always in particularly complex cases. So we'll be talking about lots of things to do with the EOTAS this evening. How it's different to elective home education is quite a big one. I've already seen a few comments about what's the difference, so we'll be covering that very, very quickly. We'll be talking about the law and what the law says around EOTAS, how EOTAS links to EHC plans, because they are intrinsically linked, how you go about requesting EOTAS, and what happens if EOTAS isn't agreed by your local authority. What's your sort of course of action that you can take? The webinar tonight, as Jess said, will finish around about 10. What I will do halfway through is just pause and gauge the room and see if anyone wants a little comfort break, because just recently on our feedback, people are saying it's nice to have a little break in the middle to go and get a cup of tea or go to the loo. So I'll just ask and see, and if you would like that, just pop it in the chat at the time. And then we will crack on and then hopefully answer lots of questions by the end. So what is EOTAS, first of all, and what is it different to just at home education? So it's otherwise than in school or at school is a very broad sort of catch-all term based on the use of the word otherwise, which appears in the Education Act and the Children and Families Act, and this is how it's described. So either by regular attendance at school or otherwise, so that's how a child might obtain their education either by regular attendance at school or otherwise. And then similarly, in the Education Act, that the local authority's duty is to make arrangements for the provision of suitable education at school or otherwise than at school. And then in the Children and Families Act, we have special educational provision in particular that might be deemed to be necessary for a child can be made in school or otherwise than in school, or at a post-16 institution or an early years institution. Now, how does that differ to elective home education? So this is what you might see EHE, elective home education. Basically, the parent of every child of compulsory school age shall have full-time education that's suitable to their age, aptitude and ability. And then this is achieved via either regular attendance at school or otherwise. And Section 9 of the Education Act essentially outlines that this duty falls to the local authority, but that parents have a particular level of right to decide how that education is delivered to their child. So some parents will electively home educate. How that's different to EOTAS is that if you choose to home educate and your child has an EHC plan, it means that you are electively saying that you will take responsibility for the provision in that plan. Now, anyone can electively home educate. You don't need an EHC plan to electively home educate. You can just say, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take my child out of school and they're going to be educated at home. You know, you have the right to do that. But where it is different to EOTAS is if you're making that decision because your child can't go to school, they're unable to go to school, school is fundamentally inappropriate for them, and your only option is for them not to go to school, then this is where EOTAS is probably what you want to be looking at. Because in many of those situations, you're not really electively home educating. You're not choosing that as a pathway for your child. You're in a situation where that is the only pathway, because sending your child to school may cause them, you know, lots of trauma, or you may not be able to send them at all because they simply can't go. On that topic, we have, for those of you who don't know, if you're new to Sunshine in this webinar tonight, we've got a fabulous service called the Sunshine Academy. It's a subscription thing. It's a bit like Netflix. It's $9.99 a month. So it's super affordable, and you can get access to all of our back catalogue of webinars and exclusive training courses and other content that you can't get anywhere else. We have a whole section on school avoidance, emotional-based school avoidance. We have a fabulous week called School Avoidance Awareness Week with lots of really good speakers. If you're listening to this from a place of being quite new to school avoidance and you're thinking, gosh, what do I do? I've got a child at home. Do I electively home educate? Do I go for EOTAS? What do I do? My advice would be to subscribe to the Academy and watch the content on school avoidance, because it's so worth it. It's super cheap. And don't tell my boss I said this, but you can, of course, unsubscribe if you want to. You don't. It's not a binding contract. You're not there for a year or anything. But certainly have a look if this is speaking to you. You're thinking, gosh, yes, I've got a child who can't attend. Have a look on there. So I'll talk a little bit more about elective home education versus EOTAS later, because there's some bits to do with the EHCP and legal stuff, which is really important to know if you're making that decision. But that comes on a later slide. So first of all, we're going to get the bit that I think is the dry bit of EOTAS out of the way, and it's all the law and what underpins what EOTAS is and how you can ask for it and how it's carried out. And there are two main laws that govern EOTAS, the Children and Families Act and the Education Act. And there's a really key pairing of words we're going to talk about, which is inappropriate and appropriate, and what is meant by a setting being deemed as inappropriate, or any school or college being deemed as inappropriate for a child. So the Children and Families Act basically says this, as we mentioned on an earlier slide, and it essentially sets out that, particularly with special educational provisions, so you have a young person with special educational needs of some description, which incidentally does not necessarily mean a diagnosis. You do not have to have a diagnosis for an education healthcare plan or to be on a special educational needs register or to require special educational provision. You do not need a diagnosis. You simply have to show that you have special educational needs of some sort. And if you have those needs, a local authority may arrange, because they decide it is necessary, for a child to be educated otherwise than in a school. And to do that, they have to be absolutely satisfied that it would be inappropriate for the provision to be made in a school. And they can't do that. They can't force that upon you without consulting you and or your child. Now, inappropriate is a really key word, because I talk to a lot of families who would like EOTAS, and they come at it with a sort of angle of, they could probably go to school for 1 or 2 days a week, but then it's just too much, so we want EOTAS for the rest of the time. Now, what you're describing there is potentially a very good model, but what it isn't is EOTAS, because the law is quite clear in saying that if a young person can access a school or college for even a proportion of the week, so say a day a week, as little as that, then that should be named on the EHC plan, and that setting receives then all the funding attributed to that EHC plan, and they essentially make the special educational provision for that young person to account for the fact that they may not be on the school site for 4 of the 5 days a week. And that's what's called alternative provision.